My name is Linda Thompson, and I'm 29 years old. As I sat in the corner of that lavishly decorated ballroom, watching my sister Beverly's wedding reception unfold, I never imagined that the most humiliating moment of my life would also become the most liberating. The crystal chandeliers cast their glow over tables filled with Beverly's successful friends and colleagues, while I remained at the farthest table feeling like an outsider at my own sister's celebration. My job as a security officer at the military base had always been a source of shame for my family, something they preferred not to discuss in polite company. But what happened next would change everything I thought I knew about respect family and my own worth. Before I tell you what happened that day that changed everything, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories. Trust me, you won't believe what my sister's groom revealed about me. Growing up, Beverly and I couldn't have been more different. She was 3 years younger, but somehow always seemed to be the one leading our relationship. After our father passed away when I was 15, our mother Margaret threw herself into raising what she called her two very different daughters. Beverly was the golden child with her blonde hair, bright smile, and natural charm that seemed to open every door. She breezed through high school with perfect grades and a social calendar that kept her busy every weekend. I, on the other hand, was the practical one. When other girls my age were dreaming about prom dresses and college parties, I was thinking about how we'd pay for Beverly's college tuition and whether Mom could handle the mortgage on her teacher's salary. The military seemed like the logical choice for me after graduation. Not glamorous, but stable with benefits and the promise of educational opportunities later. Beverly went off to UCLA to study marketing, living in sororities, and interning at prestigious advertising agencies in Los Angeles. Meanwhile, I completed my basic training and found myself stationed in Afghanistan as a security operations specialist. For 4 years, I was responsible for perimeter security at Forward Operating Base Chapman, managing access control systems, conducting security briefings, and ensuring the safety of hundreds of military personnel daily. When I returned stateside, I was offered a position at Camp Pendleton as a senior security officer. My responsibilities included overseeing entrance protocols, managing classified access systems, training new security personnel, and coordinating with various military units. It wasn't just standing at a gate checking identification cards, though that's what my family seemed to think. I held top-secret clearance-managed complex security databases and was trusted with information that could affect national security if mishandled. But every family gathering became an exercise in defending my choices. Margaret would introduce Beverly as my daughter who works for a major advertising firm in Los Angeles, while I became Linda who works at the military base. Beverly would regale everyone with stories about celebrity client meetings and corporate retreats in Napa Valley. When conversation turned to me, there would be awkward pauses and quick subject changes. Margaret never missed an opportunity to remind me that I was wasting my potential. She'd say things like, "You could have been anything, Linda. Look at your sister. She's building a real career." The implication was always clear. My service didn't count as a real career in their eyes. Everything changed when Beverly announced her engagement to Douglas Mitchell, a major in the United States Army, who had recently been transferred to a base in Southern California. For the first time in years, I felt hopeful that someone in the family might understand and appreciate military service. Here was someone who would surely respect what I did for a living. But my hopes were quickly dashed when Beverly and Margaret began planning what they called the wedding of the century. Beverly hired an expensive wedding planner and chose the Balboa Bay Resort in Newport Beach as their venue. The guest list read like a who's who of Beverly's professional network, advertising executives, minor celebrities, successful entrepreneurs, and a handful of Douglas's military colleagues who held impressive ranks. 3 months before the wedding, Margaret suggested over dinner that maybe I should just attend the ceremony and skip the reception. She said it in that careful way she had when she was trying to spare my feelings while still making her point clear. It's just that Beverly's guest list is very professional, very accomplished. We don't want anyone feeling uncomfortable. Beverly nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. I mean, I love you, Linda, but when people start asking what you do for work, it might create awkward conversations. These are important business contacts for me. I felt that familiar sting of rejection, but I pushed back. Beverly, I'm proud of what I do. I serve my country. I protect people. Why should I be ashamed of that? Nobody's asking you to be ashamed, Margaret interjected. We just think it might be better if you kept the details to yourself. Maybe just say you work in administration or something. Beverly smiled that bright, calculated smile she'd perfected over the years. Perfect solution. Just say you work in administration at the base. That sounds much more professional. I spent 2 weeks' salary on a beautiful navy blue dress and matching shoes. I practiced a maid of honor speech in my bathroom mirror, hoping that maybe this time my family would see me as someone worth celebrating. I even called Douglas once to introduce myself properly before the wedding. He was polite but seemed distracted, and our conversation lasted only a few minutes. Still, I held on to hope that he might be different. 1 week before the wedding, Beverly showed up at my apartment unannounced. She looked around my modest one-bedroom place with barely concealed disappointment before launching into what she'd clearly rehearsed. Linda, I need you to promise me something for Saturday. Please don't mention your military service or what you actually do at the base. I know it sounds harsh, but this wedding is really important for my career. There are going to be photographers there, maybe even some coverage in the society pages. I can't have people asking questions about why my sister chose such a limited career path. I stared at her. Beverly, I risked my life for this country. I've earned every promotion I've received. Why can't you just be proud of me? Her expression hardened. You're so selfish. This is my day, Linda. My wedding. And you're going to ruin it with your stubborn pride about a job that anyone could do. Just for once, can't you think about someone other than yourself? She left without another word, and I spent that night wondering if I should even attend the wedding at all. The morning of Beverly's wedding dawned perfect and clear, with the kind of California sunshine that made everything look like a movie set. I arrived at the Balboa Bay Resort early, hoping to help with last-minute preparations and maybe smooth over the tension from our argument the week before. Beverly was already in full bride mode, directing vendors and checking details with military precision. When she saw me, she managed a tight smile and immediately handed me a box of wedding favors to arrange on tables. Make sure they're perfectly centered, she said before turning away to focus on more important matters. Her bridesmaids had arrived from Los Angeles, a group of perfectly polished women in their late 20s who all seemed to work in Beverly's industry. They spoke in that animated way that people do when they're performing their friendships for an audience. When Beverly introduced me as her sister, one of them asked what I did for work. Linda works at a military installation nearby, Beverly said quickly before I could answer. In administration. Oh, how nice, the bridesmaid responded with the kind of tone people use when they're already mentally moving on to the next conversation. Beverly's told us so much about her career in advertising. It must be exciting to be around such a successful sister. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Beverly looked stunning in her designer gown, and Douglas was handsome in his military dress uniform with its array of ribbons and decorations. I sat in the back row watching as they exchanged vows under an arch of white roses overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Douglas seemed genuinely happy, and I found myself hoping that maybe he would be good for Beverly, that maybe he would help her become a kinder person. During the ceremony, I noticed Douglas glance in my direction several times. His expression was thoughtful, almost curious, but I couldn't read what he was thinking. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the crowd erupted in applause, and I clapped along while trying to ignore the hollow feeling in my chest. The cocktail hour began immediately after the ceremony, with guests mingling on the resort's oceanside terrace. I found myself gravitating toward a corner table, where I could observe without having to navigate too many conversations. Beverly was in her element, moving from group to group with Douglas at her side, accepting congratulations and posing for endless photographs. Margaret worked the room like a politician, introducing Beverly's accomplishments to anyone who would listen. "My daughter just landed the Johnson & Associates account," she'd say proudly. "Youngest account executive they've ever promoted to that level." When people asked about her other daughter, Margaret would gesture vaguely in my direction and say, "Oh, Linda lives locally too." As the evening progressed, and we moved into the main ballroom for dinner, I found myself seated at table 12, the farthest from the head table. My companions were distant relatives and family friends who didn't know me well enough to ask probing questions about my life. I picked at the expensive meal and listened to conversations about stock portfolios, vacation homes, and business mergers. The table next to mine was filled with Douglas's military colleagues, and I couldn't help but overhear their conversation about recent deployments and base operations. Part of me wanted to join in to share my own experiences, but Beverly's warnings echoed in my head. This wasn't my night to shine. This was supposed to be about supporting my sister. But as the evening wore on, I felt increasingly invisible and out of place in my own family's celebration. After the main course was cleared, Margaret stood up with a microphone to give the traditional mother of the bride speech. She looked radiant in her silver gown, every inch the proud mother, as she beamed at Beverly and Douglas at the head table. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's sound system. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate Beverly and Douglas on this magnificent day. I have to say, I always knew Beverly would achieve great things. From the time she was a little girl, she showed such ambition, such drive to succeed." Margaret went on to detail Beverly's academic achievements, her successful career trajectory, and her bright future with Douglas. "Beverly has always been my shining star," she said, raising her champagne glass. "She's accomplished everything she's set her mind to, and I know she'll bring that same determination to her marriage." The crowd murmured appreciatively, and I noticed several people at my table nodding along. Then Margaret's gaze found me across the room. "And of course, my other daughter Linda is here tonight too. She lives here locally and has found her own path." The way she said it made it sound like she was acknowledging someone's attendance at a community meeting rather than celebrating her own daughter. A few people glanced in my direction with polite smiles before quickly looking away. Margaret sat down to warm applause, and I felt my cheeks burning with embarrassment and hurt. Next came the maid of honor speech from Beverly's best friend Stephanie, who launched into a series of amusing anecdotes about their college years and professional adventures. She painted a picture of Beverly as brilliant, hilarious, and destined for greatness. "I've watched Beverly conquer every challenge life has thrown at her," Stephanie concluded. "From landing her dream job to finding her perfect man, she makes success look effortless." The applause was thunderous, and Beverly glowed with pleasure as Stephanie handed her the microphone for her response. Finally, it was time for family toasts, and Beverly gestured for me to stand up. My heart pounded as I rose from my seat at the distant table, suddenly aware that hundreds of eyes were on me. I had prepared a heartfelt speech about growing up with Beverly, about childhood memories, and my hopes for her happiness, but as I walked toward the front of the room, my mind went blank. "Thank you all for being here tonight," I began, my voice shaking slightly. "Beverly and I may be very different people, but she's always been my little sister, and I've always wanted the best for her." I started sharing a memory about how Beverly used to practice wedding ceremonies with her dolls when we were children, how she'd make me play the role of various guests and family members. The crowd seemed engaged, smiling at the sweet image of little Beverly planning her future. But then someone from the middle of the room called out loudly enough for everyone to hear, "So Linda, what do you do for work? Beverly's told us she's in advertising, but we haven't heard about your career." The question hung in the air like a challenge. I could see Beverly's face tense up, and Margaret looked like she might be sick. This was the moment they'd been dreading, the question they'd hoped no one would ask. I paused, microphone in hand, suddenly facing a choice that would define not just this moment, but my relationship with my family going forward. I could lie, could give them the sanitized version they wanted, or I could tell the truth about who I really was and what I'd accomplished. I'm a security operations specialist at Camp Pendleton, I said clearly into the microphone. I ensure the safety and security of our military personnel and facilities. The moment those words left my mouth, I saw Beverly's face go white with panic. She immediately stood up from the head table, her chair scraping loudly against the floor as she grabbed her own microphone. "Oh, please, let's be honest here." Beverly's voice cut through the room with a sharp laugh that made several guests turn to look at her in surprise. "She's just a gate guard. Who would want her?" The words hit me like a physical blow. The room erupted in scattered laughter, some nervous, some genuinely amused. I stood frozen at the front of the ballroom, still holding the microphone as my sister continued her assault. "I mean, seriously, checking IDs all day? That's not exactly career goals, is it?" Beverly gestured toward me with her champagne glass, playing to the crowd, like a comedian who'd found her rhythm. While I'm out there building real relationships with real clients, my sister sits in a little booth asking people for their identification cards. More laughter rippled through the crowd. I saw phones being pulled out, people starting to record what was clearly becoming the entertainment portion of the evening. My face burned with humiliation as I realized this moment was being captured and would probably end up on social media within hours. But Beverly wasn't finished. She was energized now by the crowd's response, emboldened by what she probably saw as finally having permission to say what she'd always thought. "Don't get me wrong, I love my sister," she continued with false sweetness. "But let's not pretend that sitting at a gate is some kind of noble calling. It's a job anyone could do. No special skills required." That's when Margaret stood up, apparently deciding that Beverly needed backup in this public dismantling of my dignity. My own mother, the woman who'd raised me, who'd watched me deploy overseas and come home safely, grabbed a microphone from the wedding coordinator. "She's the shame of this family," Margaret announced to the room full of Beverly's successful friends and colleagues. "I keep telling her to get a real job, to do something with her life, but she won't listen. Look at Beverly. Successful, beautiful, marrying a major, and Linda, well," she gestured toward me with the same expression she might use when pointing out a stain on the carpet. The laughter grew louder now, more confident. People were genuinely enjoying this spontaneous roast of the bride's unsuccessful sister. I stood there completely exposed, tears forming in my eyes, despite my best efforts to maintain composure. This was supposed to be a family celebration, a moment of joy and unity. Instead, it had become a public execution of everything I thought I was and everything I'd worked to achieve. Some guests were recording openly, now their phones held high to capture the spectacle. I could see Douglas at the head table, his expression unreadable, as he watched his new wife and mother-in-law systematically destroy me in front of their wedding guests. The humiliation was complete. I was ready to set down the microphone, walk out of that ballroom, and never speak to either of them again. But then something unexpected happened. Douglas stood up slowly from the head table, his military posture straight and commanding. The room gradually fell silent as guests turned to see what the groom would add to this entertainment. Everyone probably expected him to either join in the mockery or tactfully change the subject to save his new family from further embarrassment. But Douglas looked directly at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then he did something that stunned everyone in the room, including me. He bowed slightly and said in a clear, caring voice, "Ma'am, actually, she's the reason I'm alive today." The silence that followed Douglas's words was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop in that ballroom. Beverly's confident smile faltered, then disappeared entirely. Margaret's mouth fell open in confusion. The guests who had been laughing moments before now sat in stunned silence, phones still recording, but for entirely different reasons. Douglas remained standing, his bearing every inch the military officer, as he addressed the room full of people who had just finished mocking his wife's sister. 3 years ago, Specialist Thompson was stationed at Forward Operating Base Chapman in Afghanistan. He continued, his voice steady and clear. "I was a lieutenant then, leading a convoy that came under heavy fire outside Kandahar." He turned to face the entire room, making sure everyone could hear him clearly. The wedding guests sat transfixed, suddenly understanding that something significant was happening. We had casualties, damaged vehicles, and were pinned down by enemy fire for over 6 hours. Our communications were compromised, our medic was wounded, and we were running low on ammunition. The situation was desperate. Beverly tried to interrupt. "Douglas, I don't think this is the time or place for war stories." Douglas held up his hand politely but firmly, stopping her. "I'm not finished, Beverly." His tone was respectful, but carried an authority that made it clear he wouldn't be deterred. Specialist Thompson, despite being under direct fire herself, managed to coordinate our extraction while maintaining perimeter security. She identified weak points in the enemy's position, directed our defensive fire, and established communication with our base using backup equipment that she'd personally maintained and upgraded. I stood frozen, microphone still in my hand, as Douglas recounted details of that day that I'd tried so hard to forget. The dust, the heat, the sound of bullets striking the concrete barriers around our position. The weight of responsibility as I realized that 12 lives depended on decisions I made in those crucial hours. "She didn't just save my life," Douglas continued. "She saved the lives of 12 other soldiers that day. She received a Bronze Star with valor for her actions. That's not something the military gives out for checking IDs at a gate." Margaret looked like she might faint. The guests at the tables closest to us were leaning forward, hanging on every word. Several of the military officers in attendance had stood up, their expressions serious and respectful. Douglas wasn't finished. "When I transferred to Camp Pendleton last year, I specifically requested to work with her security unit because of her exceptional reputation throughout the military community. Specialist Thompson doesn't just guard a gate. She oversees security operations for one of the most sensitive military installations on the West Coast." Beverly's face had gone from white to red as the implications of what her husband was saying began to sink in. She'd just publicly humiliated someone who it turned out was not only a war hero, but someone her new husband held in the highest professional regard. "Your sister has top secret clearance," Douglas continued, looking directly at Beverly and Margaret. "She's responsible for protecting classified operations and ensuring the safety of thousands of military personnel daily. She's turned down multiple promotions that would have moved her to desk positions because she believes in hands-on service." He paused, then looked back at me with something that looked like respect and maybe even admiration. "Ma'am, I've been meaning to tell you the promotion board approved your recommendation for security chief position last week. You'll be overseeing security for the entire Southern California military complex starting next month." I felt tears in my eyes again, but for completely different reasons now. This promotion was something I'd applied for months ago but hadn't heard back about. It was a significant advancement that would make me one of the highest-ranking security officials in the region. Douglas turned back to address the room one final time. "So when you ask, who would want her, the United States military wants her. Her fellow soldiers want her. Her country wants her. And anyone who values courage, integrity, and selfless service should consider themselves fortunate to know someone like her." The room remained silent for several long moments. Then, one by one, the military officers in attendance began to stand. They turned toward me and rendered crisp, respectful salutes. Several other guests began to applaud slowly at first, then building to genuine, sustained appreciation. Beverly sat down heavily in her chair, her face a mixture of embarrassment and shock. Margaret looked around the room desperately, as if searching for a way to undo what had just happened. But there was no undoing it. In a matter of minutes, the narrative of the evening had completely reversed. I was no longer the embarrassing sister who couldn't get her life together. I was a decorated war veteran, a respected security professional, and someone worthy of honor rather than mockery. The immediate aftermath of Douglas's revelation was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The room that had been filled with laughter at my expense just minutes before was now buzzing with a completely different energy. Guests were looking at me with expressions ranging from admiration to shame, and several people began approaching my table to apologize for their earlier behavior. The first person to reach me was Colonel Harrison, one of Douglas's colleagues, who had been seated at a table near the front. He extended his hand with a firm handshake and said, "Specialist Thompson, it's an honor to meet you. I've heard about your work at Chapman. Outstanding service." Behind him, a line of other guests had formed, each waiting to speak with me. Some were fellow military personnel who wanted to thank me for my service. Others were civilian guests who seemed genuinely ashamed of how they'd reacted to Beverly's mockery. "I had no idea," said one woman who had been laughing particularly loudly earlier. "I'm so sorry. My brother served in Iraq, and I should have known better." An elderly man who turned out to be a World War II veteran gripped my hand tightly and said, "Thank you for your service, young lady. What you did over there, that takes real courage." Beverly remained seated at the head table, her face a mask of confusion and embarrassment. She kept glancing between me and Douglas, clearly trying to process how her perfect wedding had suddenly become about celebrating the sister she'd just finished humiliating. Douglas approached me after the initial wave of well-wishers had moved on. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I should have spoken up sooner, but I thought your family knew about your service record. I thought they were proud of what you'd accomplished." I looked at him, this man who had just completely changed the trajectory of my relationship with my family and my understanding of my own worth. "Thank you," I said simply. "That meant more to me than you'll ever know." "I meant every word," he replied. "Your reputation in the military community is exceptional. I'm honored to have the opportunity to work with you professionally." Margaret finally approached, her earlier confidence replaced by obvious discomfort. "Linda, honey, I think there's been some misunderstanding. Of course, we're proud of your military service. It's just that we didn't realize the extent of your accomplishments." I looked at my mother, this woman who had raised me but had never bothered to ask about the details of my military career, beyond the basic facts. "Mom, you never wanted to know the extent of my accomplishments. Every time I tried to tell you about my work, you changed the subject, or made it clear you thought I was wasting my potential." "That's not true," she protested weakly, but we both knew it was. Beverly finally stood up from the head table and walked over to where we were standing. Her wedding dress rustled as she moved, and I could see that her perfect makeup was slightly smudged from tears she'd been trying to hide. "Linda, I'm sorry," she said, her voice small and uncertain. "I didn't know about Afghanistan, about the Bronze Star, about any of it." I studied my sister's face, looking for genuine remorse, rather than just embarrassment at being caught looking foolish in front of her wedding guests. "You never asked Beverly. In all these years, you never once asked what I actually did in the military or what my job responsibilities were. You just assumed it wasn't important because it wasn't glamorous." "I thought I knew," she said defensively. "I thought you were just what? Just a failure. Just someone who couldn't get a real job." The words came out sharper than I'd intended, but years of accumulated hurt were finally finding their voice. Beverly flinched. "I never said you were a failure. You didn't have to say it. You've made it clear for years that you thought my life was somehow less valuable than yours because I didn't have a corporate job or a six-figure salary." The conversation was interrupted by the wedding coordinator, who reminded everyone that there were still scheduled events for the evening. The reception continued, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. Instead of being ignored or dismissed, I found myself surrounded by people who wanted to hear about my military experience and my current work. Douglas made sure I was included in every conversation, treating me with obvious respect and making it clear to everyone present that he valued my professional opinion. Beverly watched these interactions with growing discomfort, realizing that she had lost control of her own wedding narrative. Later in the evening, after the formal dancing had begun, Beverly approached me one more time. This time we were alone near the resort's outdoor balcony, away from the crowd and the music. "Linda, can we talk, really talk?" she asked. I nodded and we stepped outside where we could speak privately. "I've been thinking about what Douglas said tonight," Beverly began. "About Afghanistan, about your job, about everything. And I realized that I've been terrible to you for years without even understanding why." She paused, looking out at the ocean. "I think I was always jealous of you, if I'm being honest. You were always so independent, so sure of yourself. You never seemed to need anyone's approval the way I did. When you joined the military, I thought you were running away from real life, from real responsibilities. But you were actually running towards something I was too scared to even consider." I listened without interrupting, curious to hear where this was going. Tonight, when Douglas told everyone what you'd done, what you'd accomplished, I felt so ashamed. Not just because I'd embarrassed myself in front of my wedding guests, but because I realized I'd been embarrassed by the wrong person. I should have been embarrassed by my own behavior, not by your career choices. She turned to face me directly. "I don't know if you can forgive me, but I want you to know that I'm proud of you. I should have been proud of you all along." It was the first genuine apology I'd ever received from Beverly, and I could tell it wasn't easy for her to give. In the months that followed Beverly's wedding, my life changed in ways I never could have anticipated. The promotion Douglas had mentioned became official, and I found myself overseeing security operations for multiple military installations across Southern California. The new position came with increased responsibility, a significant salary increase, and most importantly, recognition from colleagues who understood and valued the work I was doing. Beverly and Douglas moved to Virginia when he received orders for a new assignment at the Pentagon. Before they left, Beverly and I had several long conversations that helped us begin to rebuild our relationship on more honest ground. She admitted that she'd always felt competitive with me, but had never understood why until that night at her wedding. "I think I was always trying to prove that my choices were better than yours," she told me during one of our talks. "But what I didn't realize was that we were never in competition. We were just taking different paths toward different goals." Douglas and I maintained a professional relationship through his new position. He occasionally consulted with me on security protocols, and his respect for my expertise helped validate my decision to stay in hands-on operational work rather than pursuing purely administrative roles. My relationship with Margaret took longer to repair. She struggled to admit how wrong she'd been about my career, often falling back into old patterns of trying to minimize my accomplishments or suggest that I should consider other options. But gradually, she began to show genuine interest in my work, and even bragged to her friends about her daughter, who runs security for the military. The personal changes were perhaps even more significant than the professional ones. That night at the wedding had forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about how I'd been seeking validation from people who had never been willing to give it. I realized that I'd spent years trying to prove my worth to family members who had already decided I wasn't worth much, while ignoring the respect and appreciation I received from colleagues and fellow service members. I started spending more time with people who shared my values and understood my commitment to service. I joined a veterans organization that provided support services to military families, and I began dating a fellow officer who appreciated my dedication to my work rather than seeing it as something I should outgrow. The most profound change was internal. I stopped feeling the need to justify my choices or apologize for my career path. I'd spent so many years internalizing my family's disappointment that I'd almost begun to believe they were right about me. But that night at Beverly's wedding, when Douglas spoke about my service with genuine respect and admiration, I finally saw myself through the eyes of people who mattered. The video clips from the wedding that some guests had posted on social media actually went viral, though not for the reasons Beverly had probably hoped. People were moved by the story of a family that had underestimated their military daughter, and I received messages from veterans around the country who shared similar experiences with unsupportive families. One message particularly stuck with me, from a young woman who was considering military service but was worried about her parents' disapproval. "Your story helped me realize that some people will never understand what service means," she wrote, "but that doesn't make the service any less valuable." I started speaking at veteran events and military family support groups, sharing my experience about finding self-worth independent of family approval. It wasn't something I'd ever planned to do, but I discovered that my story resonated with many people who had struggled with similar issues. Beverly's marriage to Douglas turned out to be beneficial for both of us in unexpected ways. Through him, she began to understand military culture and the sacrifices that service members make. She started volunteering with military spouse organizations and developed a genuine appreciation for the challenges faced by military families. During one of our phone calls, she said something that surprised me. "I think I understand now why you stayed in security work instead of taking promotions that would have moved you away from operations. You wanted to stay close to the actual mission to the people you were protecting. I always thought ambition meant climbing as high as possible, but your kind of ambition is about serving as effectively as possible." It was evidence that she was finally beginning to understand who I really was and what motivated me. The promotion Douglas had announced at the wedding led to other opportunities. I was selected for advanced security training, invited to consult on security protocols at other installations, and eventually offered positions that would have meant significant career advancement. But I found that I was most satisfied when I was working directly with the people and systems I was responsible for protecting. 3 years after the wedding, I received a commendation for developing new security procedures that were implemented across multiple military installations. At the ceremony, Margaret was in attendance, and for the first time in my memory, she introduced me to her friends as "my daughter, the security chief," with genuine pride in her voice. Beverly flew out from Virginia for the ceremony, bringing Douglas and their new baby daughter. Watching my sister hold her child while Douglas explained to other attendees how my security innovations had improved safety for military families, I realized that we had all finally found our way to mutual respect and understanding. The little girl they'd named Linda after me would grow up hearing very different stories about her aunt than Beverly and I had heard about each other growing up. Looking back now, 5 years after that wedding, I understand that the most painful moments in our lives often become the most transformative. That night when Beverly publicly mocked me and Margaret called me the shame of the family, I thought I was experiencing the worst humiliation of my life. What I didn't realize was that I was actually being given a gift, the gift of clarity about who I really was and what I was worth. The truth is, I had been partly complicit in my family's treatment of me. By constantly seeking their approval and trying to minimize my accomplishments to make them more comfortable, I had inadvertently reinforced their belief that my work wasn't important. I had been so focused on trying to fit into their definition of success that I'd lost sight of my own achievements and the respect I'd earned from people who understood my field. When Douglas stood up that night and told the truth about my service and my capabilities, he wasn't just defending me from Beverly's attack. He was forcing me to see myself through the eyes of someone who valued what I actually brought to the world, rather than lamenting what I hadn't become according to someone else's expectations. I learned that respect isn't something you can demand from others. It's something you give to yourself first. Some people will never understand your worth, and that's their limitation, not your failure. The opinion that matters most is the one you have of yourself, followed by the opinions of people who share your values and understand your goals. My relationship with Beverly evolved into something healthier once we both stopped trying to prove that our life choices were superior to the others. She found fulfillment in building her career and raising her family, while I found satisfaction in serving my country and protecting the people who depended on my expertise. There was room in the world for both paths, and neither of us needed to diminish the other to feel good about our own choices. Margaret eventually became one of my strongest supporters, though it took her longer to fully embrace the idea that success could be measured in ways other than salary and social status. She started attending military family events with me and developed friendships with other military parents who helped her understand the pride that comes with having a child in service. The promotion Douglas announced at the wedding was just the beginning. Over the years, I've been recognized for innovations in security protocols, leadership in crisis situations, and mentorship of younger service members. I've spoken at conferences, consulted with other installations, and built a reputation that extends far beyond the gates I once thought defined my career. But perhaps the most important thing I learned was that my worth had never been dependent on my family's recognition. The soldiers I'd served with in Afghanistan knew my value. The colleagues who trusted me with their lives and their missions knew my value. The superiors who promoted me and the subordinates who looked up to me knew my value. I had been so focused on the few people who couldn't see it that I'd almost forgotten about all the people who could. That wedding night taught me that sometimes the most painful moments become the most freeing ones. When someone tries to diminish you publicly, they often end up revealing more about themselves than about you. And sometimes the truth has a way of surfacing exactly when it needs to spoken by exactly the right person in exactly the right way to change everything you thought you knew about yourself and your place in the world. The shame Beverly tried to attach to me that night never actually belonged to me. It belonged to people who had decided that service wasn't as valuable as profit, that protection wasn't as important as prestige, that dedication to others wasn't as worthy as dedication to self-advancement. Once I understood that I was finally free to be proud of who I was and what I'd accomplished. And in the end, that freedom was worth more than any approval I'd ever sought from people who were never going to give it anyway. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where your family didn't understand or support your career choices? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to hit that like button if this story resonated with you. Please subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming family challenges and finding your own worth. Share this with someone who might need to hear that their value isn't determined by other people's opinions. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember that your worth is determined by your character, your service to others, and your own integrity, not by whether everyone around you understands it. I hope this story encourages you to stand proud in your own truth, whatever that might be.